few years ago, after some friends and I graduated from high school, we celebrated in the White Mountains National Forest Preserve. We lived only about 2 hours away, so it wasn't much of a drive. We all piled into my friend Alexis's car, along with our friends Rob, his girlfriend Stephanie, and Kelly. Alexis's car was a small Hyundai Accent, so we didn't pack much. We were headed to an Airbnb in Carroll, New Hampshire, at the height of summer. It was a gorgeous drive. When we got to the house, it looked just like the photos, except for an old run-down shed next to it. It looked like it had seen better days. I probably could have knocked it down myself. Alexis joked that maybe some old crazy guy lived in there, which was why the place was so cheap. But we all laughed it off and unpacked our things. I'll be honest, I was really into Alexis, and I think she was into me. She suggested we share a bed because the third bedroom had 2 doors leading outside and a perfect view of that old shed, so she didn't want to sleep there and wouldn't let me either. We both put our things in the living room and made the pull-out couch our bed. Not much happened the first night. Later, we all sat in the hot tub in the garage/rec room. Alexis sat next to me, facing the woods, while Rob and his girlfriend sat opposite us. Rob's girlfriend couldn't step completely into the water because of some stitches she had. Stephanie and I, always good friends, carried on with stories and joked about high school, sipping on our questionably acquired booze. Kelly, meanwhile, was changing and not with us. Rob kicked my leg under the water and winked, seeing how close Alexis was getting to me, but it wasn't a big deal. We tried to plan our next day, talking about hiking to Mount Washington and the Flume Gorge. After a good soak, I eased into bed with Alexis, and we watched Rick and Morty for a while until about 2 a.m. Then we went outside. The stargazing was supposed to be amazing. A bit later, Kelly joined us. What happened next was hard to explain. We were sitting on a huge deck in front of the house. It was pitch black, and no cars were around. We were in the middle of nowhere. No one truly understands silence until they're away from cars or planes. The sky was brightly lit with stars. Kelly hushed me, saying she heard some crunching a few feet from the porch, as if something was approaching the deck. There was definitely something walking out there. I waved it off as a raccoon or fox until the steps sounded heavy. I looked at Alexis and noticed her gaze fixed on the old shed where the footsteps seemed to be coming from. Quickly, I ushered the girls into the cabin and locked all the doors. I tried to explain that it was possibly an animal, especially if animals had taken over the old shed. Both of them calmed down. Kelly went back to her room, and I again laid down beside Alexis. The next morning, I woke up to Rob and his girlfriend cooking breakfast in the kitchen, which was just across the room from Alexis and me. We had a big day planned and did a lot of hiking, with most of us forgetting what had happened last night, except for Alexis. When we came back from hiking, Alexis suggested exploring the old shed beside the house. Now that it was daylight, nothing bad could happen, right? I didn't want to, but I didn't want Alexis to think I was a wuss. We opened the screen door and investigated the first room. There was an old rickety rocking chair that seemed like it might break if I tried to sit in it. The next door had a brass doorknob, but it was rusted and dented. I looked at Alexis before grabbing the door, and she groaned as she opened it. There wasn't much to the room. The floor was dirt, with dirt-caked windows and some trash on the floor. Alexis pointed out that it smelled of cigarette smoke. It may have been the designated smoking spot. We shrugged it off and joined the others out back, where Rob was starting a fire. Some typical conversation went on, with Rob poking fun at Alexis and me. As the sun set, I turned off the floodlight to make the ambience of our fire nicer. We shared some laughs and stories. Then there was a silence. That same crunching from last night was heard behind us, just at the tree line, except it was faster and headed in our direction. Suddenly, there was a flash of green light, illuminating the entire backyard for a moment. Whatever was running toward us halted. My thoughts were interrupted by Stephanie's screams as she bolted towards the house. Behind us, a blood-curdling cry or yelp was heard, a deafening sound that at first we thought was a siren. I instantly stood up, yelling for everyone to get inside. Stephanie must have seen whatever made that cry. In my rush, I accidentally knocked over Kelly, who hadn't yet grasped the situation. I turned to help her up while Rob was already halfway to the house. I ran to help Alexis gather our food items. The last thing we wanted was for a bear to be attracted by the food. Then I rushed Alexis to the back door where Rob was waiting with some bear spray. I already had my Bowie knife out. I commanded him to go in, but he yelled at me to go in because he had the range. The two of us saw a dark figure walking along the outskirts of our fire. We didn't stay long enough to find out what it was. After meeting the girls in the living room, we called the police immediately. The officer reported to the house, looked around with his flashlight, and found nothing. He said the flash was likely due to lightning striking a nearby power line or transformer. As for the figure, he said it was probably a fisher cat or something similar. However, Stephanie insisted she saw a man hunched over with a cloak or blanket. Needless to say, we didn't stay another night. The sheer paranoia of someone or something stalking us in the woods was enough reason to leave. We haven't returned to the mountains since. Who knows what's crawling around in those woods? My name is Howard. I'm 25 years old, and I live on my family's farm. I help take care of it when my parents are out of town. It's just a small family farm, not a commercial one or anything like that. My parents want me to take it over when they're too old to manage it anymore, as I'm the oldest of three and the only son. But honestly, I don't really want to. I don't see myself staying in the middle of Arkansas my whole life, especially not after something really weird happened last July. My parents were on a romantic trip for a week, so it was just my two sisters, Crystal and Morgan, and I taking care of the property while they were gone. There's not much around here, lots of privacy, and maybe a little too much in my opinion. One night, as it was approaching bedtime, my sisters and I were all inside. Crystal, who takes summer courses online, was in her room on her laptop doing work. Morgan and I were just hanging out, watching some dumb show in the living room. All three of us kind of want to get out of the farm lifestyle, me especially since I'm the oldest and in the prime of my 20s. One dreaded part of farm life is the predators, not just animals that come and eat your produce, but also people who come and steal from you. Believe it or not, it happens. It hasn't happened many times to us, but it does happen. We have a few guns in the house for this exact reason. Our two dogs outside suddenly started going crazy in the backyard. Something had definitely spooked them. I went outside to see what they were barking at. Both dogs were looking in the direction of the crops and going nuts. I yelled at them to be quiet, and they finally did. I stepped right in front of the crops and listened. I heard a whistling from inside the cornfield. It was undoubtedly a human's whistling. This was the first time I experienced a trespasser on the property without my dad being there. I hurried inside to get one of the guns. The dogs started barking again. I told my sisters that someone was outside in the cornfield and I had to chase them away. They both said it was a terrible idea to run into the cornfield in the dark, and they knocked some sense into me. I realized they were right and how downright terrifying that would be. Instead, I went out back to the dogs, who were still going crazy. I aimed the gun into the air and fired off a shot, which echoed into the night, silencing the dogs. I was also on some kind of power trip and screamed, "Get off our land," as loud as I could. I felt that would have done the trick and went back inside. My sisters were both laughing, which caused me to laugh too, but our little laugh didn't last long because the dogs started going crazy again, even louder this time. I went back outside, ready to do the same thing again, but my heart skipped a beat when I saw a guy standing about 20 feet from the dogs, right in front of the cornfield. He looked at me, and I screamed, "Hey!" At which point, he ran into the cornfield. I started running over and fired another shot into the air. I stopped by the dogs. There was no chance in hell I was going in there. I wasn't about to leave the dogs out here either. I unclamped their chains from the hooks and brought them inside the house. I told my sisters someone was sneaking around in the cornfield. So, what did we do? We called our dad. He told me I had to be the man of the house and protect my sisters. He recommended I fire another warning shot outside if whoever it was came back. After this, we all just gradually went to our respective rooms. My sisters each brought one of the dogs into their rooms, and I brought the gun into my room because we were all a little spooked. I had the window open, and as I was laying in bed watching a movie on my laptop, I heard whistling from outside. I hurried to the window and looked out to see someone slowly walking in the grass. Then, as if he had some sixth sense, he stopped walking and turned to look at my window, still whistling. This jerk was obviously trying to mess with us and scare us. A very stupid idea when I had already made it clear I had a gun. I ran to grab the gun off the bed and aimed it out the window. I shot at the grass, a few feet away from him, purposely missing. This cut his little horror movie act short, and he ran out of view of my window toward the front of the house. This time, he didn't come back. He'd have to be a fool to come back after that. I obviously told my sisters why I shot and assured them he would not be coming back. We never found out who it was or why. It could have been some teen or multiple teens just trying to scare some innocent farmers for fun, or it could have been someone actually dangerous. My name is Alex. I'm 22 years old, and this was the most horrifying experience of my life. I live and work in Riverton, but don't have a car, so I rely on the subway. One Saturday night, I was on my way home from a party in the middle of the night. I did this about every other weekend, so I was completely fine with taking the subway. Alone at night, walking down the steps into the underground without anyone in sight was always a bit chilling. This particular station was very cramped. As I walked, I felt like I was being watched or followed, and I occasionally heard echoing banging sounds from unknown locations. I was early for the train, so I sat on a bench to wait. Then something straight out of a horror movie happened. I heard someone say, "Over here, buddy." There was a man standing on the tracks inside the tunnel, poking his head out and looking at me. He was filthy, probably in his early 40s, and he gave me a horrible yellow smile with at least 3 teeth missing. I could see this even from where I was sitting. I did my best to ignore him, but he wouldn't go away. Then there was laughter from inside the tunnel, and another disgusting-looking man stuck his face out. This man gave me a nasty smile as well, before telling me to come hang out with them in the tunnel. The way they stared at me, their eyes locked onto me, was unsettling. I continued trying to ignore them and just waited for the train. In my peripheral vision, I noticed one of the men moving away into the tunnel, returning moments later with another face. I had to look again. There was a third face, but it was hunched over and lifeless. It looked like one of the men was holding up someone's head. The sound of the train approaching felt like 1,000 pounds off my shoulders. I got up, ready to board the train, but when I got closer to the edge of the platform, I nearly threw up at the sight. The 2 men were going back into the tunnel, and the second man was holding something in his hand, a head, just a head, like a decapitated head. They disappeared from sight onto the side of the tunnel as the train stopped. I got into the first car, planning on warning the conductor, but as soon as we left the station, I didn't want to be there a second longer. As the train began to move, I saw legs moving down the stairs to the platform, but that was it. I didn't get to see who it was, but what I did see as the train moved into the tunnel was a group of men huddled up against the railing, inches away from the train window, all looking right at me. I knocked on the conductor's door like a madman, screaming that it was an emergency. He opened up, and I explained what I had just seen. He radioed someone in charge of the station and another higher up in the company, who I'm sure contacted the proper authorities or security. It seemed to take ages for my stop to come, but when it did, I practically ran out of the station from relief. Since then, I had been to one party at the same friend's house, but I skipped that station. I decided it was worth it to take the extra long walk to the next station. I don't know if weird stuff happens often in the subway at night. In my experience prior to this incident, it never did. But after this experience, I think it's important to say that you should be extremely cautious when in an isolated place like a subway station late at night. I live in a pretty basic suburban town in Greenfield, California. My girlfriend Hannah and I recently started renting a small house, perfect for 2 to 4 people. We have a decent-sized backyard, and our house is on a very quiet street. One side of our house has a water drainage basin, which is just a bunch of trees surrounding a sump. On the other side is our neighbor Dave, who lives with his wife. They're a bit older, in their 60s, and quiet. Directly across the street is a little patch of woods in front of another water drainage basin. For people who like privacy, our house is perfect. But then there's the backyard. Dave's house is blocked off by some bushes that the landlord planted years ago. Besides the house directly behind us over the fence, there are no other houses that can see into our yard. However, that one house looking into our backyard has made Hannah and me genuinely uncomfortable. As I'm writing this, it's currently fall, so we've been doing fall cleanup in the front and backyard for the past few weeks. I started noticing that whenever we were out there, two people were always standing at the upstairs window of the house behind us. It was a middle-aged man and woman. When I'd look up at the window, they'd keep staring and watching me. It got really uncomfortable to the point where we pretended not to notice it, but we could only stomach this for so long. The leaves kept falling day by day, and the fall cleaning needed to continue. Hannah didn't want to be in the yard anymore because she was so creeped out by those two people who watched us from the window without fail. One foggy day, while raking, I looked up at the window, and once again, the two were standing there. I decided to wave at them to see if they'd wave back. After a few seconds of smiling and waving, they didn't move. No reaction. But I could feel their stares, and I could see their eyes looking at me. I turned away from the window and tried to continue raking, but after sneaking a peek back at the window a couple of minutes later and seeing them still there, I felt too awkward and weird being out there. I went inside. Hannah suggested we go over and introduce ourselves. At first, I was hesitant, but she persuaded me to walk around the block with her to that house and ring the bell. We expected one of those people at the window to answer the door, but instead, the door cracked open just enough to see half of a person's head. It didn't look like either of the people who were always at the window. It was also super dark inside the house, making it look incredibly eerie. The guy looked a lot younger, like in his 20s. Hannah and I tried to be friendly and introduce ourselves, but the guy seemed very closed off and not interested in talking. He had a "what do you need" attitude. When I asked if he lived with anyone else, like his parents, he said no. I mentioned the man and woman who were always at the window upstairs, and the guy said he didn't know who I was talking about. Hannah and I felt really unsettled, so we left. But as we walked away, I noticed the guy was still peering at us through the cracked open door. I'm sure he watched us until we were out of sight. That interaction was weirder and creepier than we expected. When we got back home, I went upstairs to our room. The upstairs of our house only has our master bedroom and the bathroom. It has 2 windows. One of the windows looks over to that house behind the fence. I looked out the window and saw those 2 people looking out the window again. Even at this distance, I felt like they were staring right at me. I shut the blinds and went down to tell Hannah. We agreed it was time to plant some shrubs to block their window from view. The only problem is it's already fall, and it's too late to plant any trees. We have to make it through winter. After a few days of not looking outside the bedroom window or going into the backyard, one night we heard a strange knocking sound from downstairs. I told Hannah to wait in bed while I went downstairs. The knocking got louder, and I quickly discovered it wasn't on one of the doors, but rather on the glass of one of the backyard windows. The blinds were shut because we didn't want those creepy people looking into our living room at night. I approached the window, and yes, it was 100% a fist knocking on the glass. I considered saying, "Who's there?" but I froze and was too scared. Instead, I flicked on the backyard light, and then the knocking stopped. I didn't even want to look out the window or door. I kept the light on and went back upstairs to my room, where I told Hannah about the creepy knocking. I claimed I chased whoever it was away. I exaggerated because I didn't want to sound like a coward, and I didn't want her to worry. We both imagined it had something to do with that house. Nothing has happened since, but I'll have to update throughout the winter. It's been 2 weeks, and we haven't seen those people at the window. But last night, we heard yelling and screaming from that house. I opened our window, and it became clear there were muffled yells coming from that house. The fact that we heard it through 2 sets of closed windows just shows how loud the yelling was. Then, out of nowhere, it just stopped and went quiet. We almost called the police, but ultimately didn't. I'll update again if anything else happens, but we're really getting creeped out here. I was 21 years old when I went fishing with my 84-year-old grandfather for the first time. We took an hour-long drive from our suburban home to a more remote part of the state. My grandfather always fished at this one particular lake that hardly anyone knew about, where he somehow always left with coolers full of fish. He was a serious fisherman, that much was clear. I didn't even know there were specific terms for different parts of fishing, but he was throwing around terms I'd never heard of, even during the car ride, which finally ended when we turned off the main quiet road and onto about 2 miles of dirt trails. He parked his Jeep at the side of the trail, and from there we carried the small boat through some thick forest. Even at 84 years old, my grandpa was strong. In fact, I was getting tired from carrying the boat, but I didn't want to show it by asking to stop for a break. It would have been embarrassing if he could carry it longer than I could. I'll skip ahead to when we were actually sitting in the boat, fishing. He had just finished showing me how to get the line and hook in the water. After that, he didn't say much, focusing intently on what he was doing. I turned around to ask him a question, but he seemed to be leaning in, staring at something in the water. He didn't respond, so I went back to concentrating on fishing. About 20 seconds later, I turned around out of curiosity, and he was leaning even closer. I started to worry that something might be wrong. I put my hand on his shoulder, and that's when I heard splashing sounds. My grandpa seemed to push something back into the water and then yelled at the top of his lungs for me to paddle as fast as I could back the way we came. My heart was racing. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew it wasn't good. As soon as the boat hit the dirt, my grandpa was moving as fast as he could, getting out of the boat and heading back to the car. We left the boat and all our gear behind. When we got to the car, he floored it down the trails, and I kept screaming at him to tell me what had happened. It took him about 10 minutes to gather his thoughts before he finally said, "I was looking down into the water, and I knew I saw something." It kept getting closer to the surface, clearer as it got closer, and I swear it looked like a face. Then it got even closer, and as I was leaning in to get a better look, something reached out and grabbed me. That was all he would say for a while, but a few weeks later, he tried to describe what he saw. From his description, it sounded almost like he was describing a human face. Almost. But the thing I remember most was him saying, "All I know is it wasn't." This happened to a friend of mine who lived in the same neighborhood as me when we were about 8 or 9 years old. My friend Sarah and her family lived just a few houses down the street from mine. We lived in a neighborhood where almost everyone knew each other. The biggest concern we ever had was that someone from outside might come into the neighborhood and cause trouble. Some people even left their homes unlocked because we felt so safe there. There was a really nice family that lived directly across the street from Sarah's house. A mom, a dad, a 16-year-old son, and the other son, Jake, who was 22 years old and had special needs. I'll call him Jake. Jake was always home because he couldn't work due to his disability. His parents worked full-time and his brother was in school all day. Jake would often be outside, waving and smiling at anyone who drove or walked by. He had a big, friendly smile and sometimes giggled with pure excitement and happiness from interacting with people as he spent most of his time alone. He never seemed creepy to me at all. One day, Sarah was sick and didn't go to school. Even though she was only about 8 or 9, she was allowed to stay home by herself when she was sick, especially since her mom was going to be home around 2 p.m. anyway. It was a very safe neighborhood. All the doors were locked, except for the one leading to the garage. They used this as their main entrance because it was easier in those cookie-cutter homes to just open the garage, pull in, and walk into the house through the unlocked door that connected the garage to the house. This wasn't the safest way to protect the house from intruders, but almost everyone in the neighborhood did it. They even kept the garage door slightly open so their cat could get inside for food or shelter. Sarah was asleep with a fever, and all the doors and windows were locked except for the door leading into the garage. Jake probably knew she was home alone since he was always outside in front of his house. At some point, Sarah woke up to loud knocking on the front door. Startled, she went downstairs and looked through the peephole. It was Jake. She opened the door a bit and he said something about how he noticed everything and would watch over her house since she was home alone. She thanked him but said there was no need and wished him a good day. The weather was beautiful that day. However, Jake seemed upset and angrily said, "You think I can't do it because I'm dumb, but you'll see. I'm not dumb." She apologized, saying she didn't mean it that way and needed to rest. She then dozed off again. Later, she woke up to a noise downstairs in the kitchen, the room connected to the garage. She hadn't heard the garage door open, but since she was sick, she figured she had been in a deep sleep and missed it. Disoriented, she looked at the clock. It was 10:20 a.m., too early for her mom to be home. She heard noises again downstairs. Without calling out, she quickly ran into her parents' bathroom and slammed the door, only to remember that it had no lock. The noise she made alerted whoever was in the house to where she was. She heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. Panicking, she moved quietly to her parents' closet, hid behind some clothes, and tried not to make a sound. Through the slats of the closet door, she saw Jake enter the bedroom. He was tall and thin, and he was holding a knife. Sarah did everything she could not to scream. Jake looked around the room, checking the bathroom where she had just been. When he didn't find her, he started making frustrated noises and paced around the house. She stayed hidden in the closet for hours, even after she heard him leave through the front door. She only came out when her mom got home. Sarah was crying hysterically and told her mom what happened. If she hadn't been so upset, and if one of their kitchen knives hadn't been found by the front door, her mom might have thought she was imagining things because of her fever. Nobody ever expected Jake to do something like that. The police were called, and an official report was filed. I'm not sure if any charges were pressed against him, because after Sarah told me the story once, she refused to talk about it again. I overheard her parents talking about the situation with mine a few times, but I never found out what happened next. Sarah was so traumatized that she went to therapy for several years and still didn't talk about it. Even when we moved into an apartment together years later for college, she never mentioned Jake again, as if he never existed, and I didn't ask. I noticed that she always locked the front door, which of course everyone should do, but she also always locked the door leading to the balcony, even though we were on the 7th floor, and she added an extra lock to her bedroom door. When she locked all the doors and windows, she would usually check them 3 times. I often wondered if there was more to the story than what Sarah told me. We were just kids after all, and sometimes kids don't know how to explain things they don't fully understand. It's terrifying to think about what his intentions were and what might have happened if he had found Sarah. As horrifying as the experience must have been for her, it served as a serious warning to the neighborhood to be more careful. Now, I always make sure everything is locked. Last year was the first time I ever experienced something unsettling on a camping trip. I usually go camping alone several times a year, often to the same spots, but sometimes I try to find new places. For this trip, I chose a 4-mile camping trail I had never been on before. I drove 2 hours from my house to a remote location where I started the hike. Right away, I was not enjoying the trail as much as I thought I would, mainly because some parts were wet and muddy. Still, I continued along, trying to avoid those spots. About 45 minutes in, I saw something off the side of the trail. It was a tent, very worn down and with a few rips in it. From afar, I could see that nobody was inside, so I walked closer. There were no signs of intentional damage. It all just seemed weathered over a long period of time. The fact that it was still standing was mind-blowing to me. I looked around and inside the tent, but there was nothing else. No belongings, just the tent itself. After a couple of minutes, I went back to the trail. I thought about it for a while, but couldn't come up with any good reasons why someone would leave a tent like that. As I walked the last hour and a half of the trail, I came across dozens of abandoned objects, all camping or hiking equipment. Seeing all this stuff scattered around gave me an uneasy feeling. Who would leave everything behind? It was definitely not an accident, and I was pretty sure it was all from one person. When I got to the end, I set up my tent a good distance away from the trail, just to be safe. It was already getting dark, so I stayed at my campsite until I was ready to sleep. I felt a bit nervous, but was able to sleep through the night without any issues. When I got up, it was early in the morning, around 4 or 5, so the sun wasn't fully up yet. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, but right away, I could tell something was wrong. I turned around, and on the other side of my tent, a man stood just a few feet away. He was tall and thin, wearing dirty clothes, and his face was covered in grime. He looked at me with an empty stare. I stood there motionless, shocked and scared. He spoke in a soft yet creepy tone. "Leave." I nodded and quickly started gathering my backpack, but he immediately rushed toward me. I fell back and could only say, "Okay," over and over. The man stood over me with that same empty look in his eyes and said again, "Leave." I understood what he meant this time and quickly got up and rushed away, leaving everything behind. I took one look back as I got out of there and saw the man rummaging through my backpack like a curious animal. I jogged as far as I could, then fast walked the rest of the way to my car. Thank God I kept my phone and keys in my pocket, or this situation could have been much worse. I drove until I got cell service and called 911. I found out there was an almost identical case to what I experienced, but the person who filed it chose not to make it public. This was likely the person whose tent and belongings I found on the trail. After a week of talking to the police and going over everything, they organized a small search party of officers. They went down the trail and came back with no sightings or evidence of the man, but found most of my stuff scattered around my campsite like trash. After that, the case went cold, just like the previous one. The thing I always come back to is how the man didn't keep anything. He just scattered it all around the forest with no intention of using any of it.